Is there anything you'd like to discuss?
So I forgot the word you used yesterday, but like a filter of reality versus reality. I don't know if I'm capturing it right. Like there's reality and then there's our like perceived reality or filter of
Yes,
it.
I suggested that our mind filtered reality according to its own limitations.
Right.
Just as if you're walking in the snow and you put on a pair of orange tinted glasses, you filter the color of the snow through your sunglasses.
So sometimes it feels like you don't know if it's filtered reality or not. So like in life, there feels like there's like societal hierarchy.
No, you can be absolutely sure that everything you know or experience is filtered through your mind.
But what do you do with that next? So for example, this is not a psychological question in terms of like I want to resolve this for me individually and personally, and I need to have therapy or something. This is a question about like life and social structures, and so like this institutional like racism and structural racism is something that is apparently a filtered perception, just like everything else is. But then what next? Like, what do you do with that? Like, if I'm angry and I want to fight, then like just do it? Like, or is like you have to be cautious? It's a filtered perception.
If you are angry or depressed or lonely or any other feeling that you have, you check first on whose behalf your feeling is arising. Is it on behalf of a temporary, finite self? And if it is, then check
But what if
the nature of this temporary, finite self before you start feeling and subsequently acting and relating on its behalf. Check the truth of the temporary, finite self that is at the origin of your feeling.
But even if it is a temporary, finite, like...
Well, if it is arising on behalf of a temporary, finite self, rather than expressing your anger, investigate that self.
But then what if it's not? Like, what if...
Well, if you discover that the self on whose behalf your feeling arises is not there, or is not the temporary, finite self that you thought it was, what is going to happen to its feelings? If you investigate the self on whose behalf your feelings arise, the separate self, the temporary, finite self, on whose behalf your feelings rise.
But I feel like that's dismissing like that filtered perception of the hierarchy. Like what about that injustice that's existing? If I just sit there and explore that temporary self, like I feel like that's
if you're feeling of, sorry to interrupt you, but if you're feeling a feeling of injustice doesn't necessarily arise on behalf of a temporary, finite self. It arises on behalf of love and intelligence, in which case follow the feeling of injustice, don't investigate. There's no need to investigate the separate self. It is not, the feeling of injustice is not necessarily arising on behalf of a separate self. It may be, you have to check that first, but if it's not, if it is an expression of love and intelligence, then pursue the feeling of injustice and act accordingly.
And then how do you know the difference of, you have to just investigate it yourself?
Well, one of the ways would be that you don't feel personally hurt or upset. You don't feel that you have been diminished in any way by what you are responding to. In other words, your response is not the response of a hurt, disrespected, unloved person. So that would be one way at an emotional level to know whether or not your feelings were coming from a sense of separation or whether they were arising on behalf of love and intelligence.
But, one last thing, because I know I'm taking a lot of time, is like, but what if, but still, can't you be non-separate and that's clear and it's been investigated and it's clear and still like feelings are going to come up in response to what's happening in life?
Well, if you've investigated yourself and you're sure that your feelings and your subsequent activities are not arising on behalf of the sense of separation, then feel completely free to express your feelings in action.
But then it comes back to too, how do you know the difference with the feelings? But I don't, okay, yeah. Because then you're still feeling, but you know it's not coming out of a separate self.
There are feelings that arise on behalf of the sense of being a temporary finite self, and there are feelings that arise on behalf of love and intelligence.
Okay, thank you very much.
Pursue the latter, investigate the former.
Thank you.
Thank you. This actually kind of follows up on that, and my question is this, is that when one is able to contact and act from the source, then I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the effect of that on, I mean, I've heard saints say that, you know, if it weren't for people in contact with that source, the world would be a much bigger mess than it is. In other words, there's action on the level of action, and there's contacting reality, and somehow the influence of that kind of fertilizes and bubbles up throughout all activity. And I wonder if you have any thought on that, if you understand what I'm asking.
Well, let me respond, and if I'm not responding to your question, let me know. Yes, I would agree. In fact, I would go further and say that the greatest service one can render humanity is to recognize one's true nature. Because all of our minds are precipitated within the same consciousness. Just as under the materialist paradigm, all our bodies appear in the same space. And for the same reason that under the prevailing materialist paradigm, all our bodies are in contact with each other because they appear in the same space. Likewise, under the consciousness-only model, each of our minds is precipitated within the same awareness and therefore are in contact with each other. In fact, the mind is not an isolated entity. So yes, there is a subliminal effect on all minds when one mind recognizes its essence.
And then do you feel that subliminal effect inevitably, on some level, to some degree, has an effect of precipitating action that's more in harmony with that level?
At some level and to some degree, yes. Whether it is sufficient to bring about a marked change in society is another matter. But yes, at least to some degree. Yes. You too. Yeah. Just here in turquoise.
Thank you. So great to see you in person, Rupert. If I may, my question is somewhat philosophical. A couple parts, but very briefly. So there's the inward path, which is a sort of awakening, and then the outward path, it could be seen as the evolution of the separate self. And so my question is then, is this a continued evolution of lifetimes? Does the infinite consciousness manifest and remanifest?
Okay, let me just slightly reformulate your first statement about the inward and outward facing paths, and many of you may not be familiar with these terms. The inward facing path is the term that I sometimes use for the initial stage of our investigation, when we turn away from the content of our experience and investigate ourself, our essential self, not our thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions, activities or relationships, but ourself. So this involves not necessarily a turning away from experience, but at least a softening of the focus of our attention from its objective content and a return of the attention to its source. This is the essence of meditation or prayer, and I refer to it as the inward facing path because it is inward in the sense it is not in the direction of experience, objective experience. So the outward facing path would then be the path that we engage in, having recognized the essential nature of ourselves. We turn around, so to speak, and face again the objects of experience which we previously turned away from, with the purpose of realigning the way we think and feel and subsequently act, perceive and relate in the world. But the little adjustment that I wanted to make was that this would not be the evolution of a separate self. The separate self, through the inward facing path, has been discovered to be an illusion. There is no separate self. Okay. So having discovered that, we then turn around again, and our thoughts, feelings, activities and relationships are then reorchestrated in line with our new understanding that what we essentially are is not a temporary, finite self, but is rather this infinite and shared consciousness. Now, the second part of your question, does this go on for lifetimes? Yes, we have to be open to the possibility that under this model, the body, the mind does not appear in the body. The body is well, let's just say this, that in this, from this perspective, that the mind would not come to an end when the body dies. So the mind could continue to evolve after the death of the body in this perspective. I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but yes, in principle, there's no reason why the evolution of a finite mind should be limited to a single lifetime.
Okay. So there is some sense of evolution, or
yes, but so let's not worry about other lives. Yeah. Let's just talk about this life. Yes, yeah. I sometimes suggest that if the spiritual process, if we can call it a spiritual process, was a book consisting of 12 chapters, the recognition of our true nature takes place at the end of chapter 1. It is not, as is sometimes supposed, the end of the process. It is the end of the belief that we are a temporary finite self. But once that belief comes to an end, that belief then has to be taken deeply into the way we not only think, but the way we feel the body and perceive the world. And so the subsequent 11 chapters of the book are devoted to realigning the way we think, feel, act, perceive, and relate with our new enlightened understanding. In fact, it's a book that never really ends.
Yeah. So one more part actually. But with each incarnation, or if there's a reincarnation, you go through the stage of the ego or the separate self. You become, so there's a veil or something drops or something. And I'm taking this from some spiritual teachings. But
there is no separate self. There is
yes.
just the self, if we can call it a self,
Okay.
the true and only self of pure consciousness. When I say pure consciousness, I mean, or pure awareness, I mean consciousness that is not yet mixed with or limited by the content of experience, thoughts, images, feelings, etc.
Yeah.
So the separate self is an imaginary veiling
Right.
of the true and only self of pure consciousness.
Right.
Let me give you an analogy to make that possibly abstract idea a bit more contract, a bit more, to give it some context. Imagine an actor, John Smith, who plays the part of King Lear. Now, there is no real person called King Lear. All there is to King Lear is John Smith, to which a suit of clothes and a series of thoughts and feelings have been added. This mixture of John Smith plus thoughts and feelings makes for the apparently individual person called King Lear. But there is no real person called King Lear. Likewise, each of us is, in this analogy, John Smith, the true and only self of ever-present, unlimited consciousness, plus, or clothed in, thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, and perceptions. And this mixture of awareness plus experience creates an illusory separate self. So the illusory separate self that most people believe and feel themselves to be is a mixture of two things. One, the true and only self of pure awareness, and two, a series of thoughts, images, feelings, etc. So, by the way, I don't mean to imply that these thoughts, images, feelings are imposed on awareness from the outside. There is nowhere outside awareness from which they could originate. It is awareness itself, through its own activity, that assumes the form of thinking and perceiving, and thereby limits itself, just as King Lear is not imposed on John Smith from the outside. It is the actor John Smith who freely assumes the form or the character of King Lear in order to have a relationship with Cordelia and be the King of England. But even when John Smith is clothed, as it were, in King Lear's thoughts and feelings, he never really ceases to be John Smith. He never really becomes King Lear. Likewise, infinite consciousness, the only consciousness there is, clothes itself in each of our thoughts and perceptions and seems, as a result, to become a separate self, but never really ceases to be itself. In other words, there is no real separate self or finite consciousness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert, for your talk yesterday and also for your answers. First, I became aware of my programmed mind, and I saw that that is controlling me. Then I tried to be the one who sees the programmed mind, not be the programmed mind. You have an advice that being aware of being aware. I am aware that I'm aware, but I am also addicted to my previous self, and that self controls the body, and I lose the awareness. Awareness is still there, but I'm not aware that I'm aware. How can we stay on position that we are aware of being aware, like not let the mind takes control of the body.
Okay. So what you're saying is that you have recognized that what you essentially are is awareness, but for most of the time, you, awareness, are so lost in the content of your experience that you forget or overlook yourself. And occasionally, you notice this, and you disentangle yourself from your experience and, as it were, go back to yourself. You don't really go back to yourself because you never left yourself, but you understand.
Yes.
You go back to yourself, but then through force of habit, experience has the power to pull you away from yourself, and so you lose yourself in the content of your experience again. So there is this back and forth.
Yes.
And you spend most of your time lost in the content of your experience. And
50-50.
No? Okay, let's say you spend 50% of the time.
He's doing well.
It's not too bad. You spend 50% of the time lost in the content of your experience, and 50% of your time knowingly in touch with yourself, and most importantly, in touch with its innate peace and happiness. So just become accustomed to remaining in touch with yourself, not in the absence of experience, but in the midst of experience. To begin with, when we first come across this understanding, we sometimes have to close our eyes and turn away from experience in order to familiarize ourselves with ourself. But in time, it's no longer necessary to close our eyes and turn away from experience, because even in the midst of experience, we are still ourself. In other words, in time, experience loses its capacity to take us away from ourself. And in time, we find that fewer and fewer experiences have the capacity to take us away from ourself, until a certain point comes when we simply feel established in the peace of our true nature in the midst of almost all experience. I say almost all experience because we must leave open the possibility that we never know what's going to happen. There may sometimes something may happen that triggers an old reaction, and we are temporarily lose ourselves to that experience. But it happens less and less frequently, and when it does happen, it lasts for less and less time.
I see, yeah. Actually, I resonate with that because I had that understanding like a year and a half ago. Yeah. In the beginning, it was, I could say, like 10% I was aware and 90% not, but now I see it as the time passes, I am getting closer.
Another way of expressing it would be to say that experience becomes increasingly transparent to its reality. It's not necessary to touch experience or change it or manipulate it. It's in just the same way that when you're watching a movie, if you're totally involved in the movie, you may feel that you no longer see the screen. You may believe you see a landscape. But in time, the landscape loses its capacity to veil its reality, the screen. And there's no need to turn the movie off or change the content of the movie. It's the same. Experience becomes transparent to its reality, and you feel, and then there is no longer any need to negotiate experience. This is what Krishnamurti was referring to when, at the end of his life, somebody asked him, do you have a final secret teaching for us? And he said, yes, I do have one final teaching for you. And of course, everyone was on the edge of their chairs waiting for this marvelous new teaching. And he simply said, I don't mind what happens. he was speaking of this understanding. What he was saying was, my experience has lost its capacity to veil my own being and its innate peace and happiness. And therefore my peace and happiness is no longer invested in experience, so I don't mind what happens. My peace is prior to experience, not dependent upon experience.
Thank you.
Rupert, I have an understanding, and I wondered if I could say it to you and see if it what your reaction to it is. But we all talk about consciousness and how consciousness is primary. But I have an understanding, it's really from the Vedic tradition of India, of how consciousness does this thing of having the universe, however you want to say it, arise in consciousness, how this is created. And it's in terms of what the last two people were talking, the experiencer and the experienced and the process of experiencing. So the understanding is that the first movement in that direction is that consciousness, being consciousness, becomes conscious of itself. So it's still one, it's still consciousness, but it's self-conscious, it's conscious of itself. And so there's a kind of a two. And
sorry to interrupt you, but everything you say downstream will contain this original mistake, so that's why I'm stopping you here. Consciousness is like the sun. The sun doesn't when the sun first appeared, the sun didn't at some point in evolution begin to illuminate itself. The sun's nature is illumination. It illuminates itself from the very beginning, because that's what it is. It is it is illumination, it is shining, it is by nature self-illuminating. Consciousness is like that. Consciousness is knowledge of itself, is not a sign of the evolution of consciousness. Consciousness, by definition, is self-knowing, or self-luminous, or self-aware. And its knowledge of itself is not a knowledge of induality. It's not, when consciousness knows itself, that knowledge does not take place in subject-object relationship. It is the only experience there is, the only experience there is, in which the subject of experience and the object of experience are the same. In other words, there is no subject or object of experience in consciousness's knowledge of itself.
I understand. I guess what I'm getting at is, how does consciousness begin the game of apparent duality?
It begins to vibrate within itself, and this vibration gives its otherwise formless being a form. And having a form, it begins to limit itself. In exactly the same way that when you have a dream at night, your mind is a field of infinite potential in which all possible dreams lie unmanifest. But your own mind assumes the form of one of those dreams, and by doing so immediately limits itself. And then,
but who's limiting who? Is consciousness limiting itself?
Is limiting itself, because there is nothing in consciousness other than consciousness with which consciousness could be limited. Consciousness freely assumes the form of the finite mind in order to bring what lies in potential within it into manifestation.
But how, in your view, does it get lost in that?
That is the price consciousness pays for manifestation. Just as when you have a dream at night, your own mind imagines the dreamed world within itself, and simultaneously forgets or overlooks that it is dreaming. That is the price your mind pays for dreaming that you are walking on the streets of Paris. You have forgotten that you are dreaming, And that forgetting of the nature of your own mind enables your mind to assume the streets of Paris. But you cannot view the streets of Paris directly from your own mind asleep in San Jose. You have to enter into your own dream. Your own mind has to localize itself in its own dream as the dreamed character, the separate subject of experience, from whose perspective the dreamed world is known. In other words, your own mind divides itself into a subject, the dreamed character, and an object, the dreamed world. And this subject-object relationship seems to be true from the perspective of the separate subject of experience in the dream. But when you wake up, you realize, no, experience was not divided into a subject and an object, into mind and matter. It was all the activity of my own infinite, indivisible mind. So just consider the possibility that, unlike your own mind, which localizes itself as a single dream character in the dream, from whose perspective the dreamed world is known, that the one mind, infinite consciousness, imagines the universe within itself. The universe, in other words, is the activity or imagination of consciousness, but it has to overlook itself. Why? Because the infinite cannot know the finite. The infinite can only know the infinite. Consciousness can only know itself. If it wants to know a world, it has to overlook the knowing of its own being. It has to consent to localize itself in the form of each of our minds, from whose perspective consciousness views its own activity as the outside world. In other words, just as the price you pay for enjoying dreaming that you're in Paris is the forgetting or the overlooking of the nature of your own mind. Likewise, the price consciousness pays for realizing or manifesting its infinite potential in the form of the world is the forgetting or overlooking of itself. And this forgetting or overlooking of itself and its innate peace and happiness it leaves a trace in each of our minds, and that trace is called suffering. Suffering is the price God pays for manifestation. And that is why when we suffer, we are always longing for one thing alone, happiness. What is happiness? The knowing of our own being. So this as consciousness contracts or localizes itself in the form of the finite mind, it limits itself. And this limited self that each of us seems to be, there's one thing alone that everybody seeks. Not just those of us interested in non-duality, but all 7 billion of us seek one thing alone. It's happiness, which means we seek to be divested of the limitations of the separate self and return to our origin or source. The search for enlightenment is simply a rebranding of the common search for happiness. Whether we are searching for happiness or enlightenment, it is the same thing. All anybody ever seeks is to be divested of the limitations that they seem to acquire from experience, and as a result for their true nature of happiness to shine.
Thank you.
And then we'll come over here in a minute.
I sometimes feel that the practices I'm doing to
Just use the mic, that's it.
To experience peace, true peace, help align me a little bit with the true self. Can you speak some more of that?
You can undertake practices that will help to align you with the peace of your true nature, but why not go directly to the peace of your true nature? Why not go for the full experience, rather than just to be aligned with your true nature through various practices?
Yes.
you just go directly to your true nature. Why would you choose to go there through an indirect?
It's an imitation. I'm trying. It's an imitation when I'm not quite there.
But the invitation, when we feel that we're not quite there, is always the invitation from ourself to return to ourself.
An invitation?
The invitation, in other words, the desire for peace, for happiness, is always the invitation from the true and only self of pure awareness to the supposedly separate self. So when we feel, when we suffer, when we long for happiness or peace, we feel that we as a separate self embark on a series of practices in order to recover or return to ourself. No, there is no such separate self, either to practice or not to practice. The longing for happiness is the pull that is exerted on the apparently separate self from the true and only self of awareness. That pull is interpreted by the separate self as my desire for happiness. I am going to practice and approach happiness. That is just an erroneous interpretation. The separate self does nothing because there is no separate self. The separate self's desire for happiness is really the pull of grace from the true and only self, whose nature is happiness itself.
Thank you.
So when you feel that pull, just go directly to the source of peace, which is the knowing of your own being before it is colored or qualified by experience. And if you cannot go directly to your being, in other words, if you have to go via any kind of object, take the subtlest object, the thought, I am. Just take that thought once, the thought I am, and then go in your experience to that to which the thought I am refers. In other words, go straight back to your being. Okay, let's come over here. Yes, at the back, and then here. Yep.
Hi, and thank you so much for your teachings in your articulate way of describing some very complicated topics. However, I'm still confused. And it's the theme, it seems, of today, which is how, maybe personally, did you, after chapter 1, navigate through to chapter whatever, infinity, in that it feels like at the moment, a bit schizophrenic, pardon that word, to constantly in every moment be asking myself, is this coming from ego or the big self? No. Is it like, is this feeling coming from the idea that I'm separate, or is this feeling coming from a true place of who I really am in every moment of my existence? And does that get easier over time? Do you have to, at some point, you stop questioning that and yes, you just are?
At some point, you stop questioning it. You've explored it so thoroughly, so many times, that you no longer need to go through the questioning process. You just go directly. If you find yourself lost in experience, you just go directly to yourself. There's no longer an inquiry or an investigation. But you're quite right. It is not necessary to continually remind oneself, moment by moment, just as you do not walk down the street or engage in your activities continually reminding yourself that you are a woman. You don't at every moment stop and investigate whether you're a woman. It is just, you have just grown up feeling I am a woman. It is just that thought and feeling is interwoven into your thoughts, feelings, activities and relationships. You don't need to keep reminding yourself. Well, it's exactly the same here. We do this investigation. To begin with, it does require an investigation. What is it that is essential to me? What is essential to me cannot be removed from me. All my thoughts, images, feelings, memories, activities, relationships can be removed from me. So if I remove or imagine removing all of these from me, what remains? This is just a process that we go through. And it may take half an hour the first time we do it. But the next time we do it, it'll take 25 minutes, and then 20, 15. And after a while, it is only necessary to ask the question, what am I really? And we go straight there. But having visited oneself or returned to oneself on numerous occasions, as I suggested earlier, our self is no longer something that we visit from time to time. We begin to spend, it's not just, we don't just go there for the evening, we go there for the weekend. And then we don't just go there for the weekend, we go there for a 2-week vacation. And then we decide we like it, we move in. It becomes our new default. And because it's our new default, we don't need to keep reminding us. We don't need to keep doing the investigation, because it's obvious to us now. Nor do we even need to keep reminding ourselves, because it is our default. Just as we previously didn't need to remind ourselves, I am a man, I am a woman all the time. It was just our default position. So now we don't need to keep reminding ourselves, I am this inherently peaceful, unconditionally fulfilled presence of awareness. It just is our default, and it informs the way we think and feel, and subsequently act, perceive, and relate.
So there's never a moment anymore in which you have to say, is this desire coming from my erroneous view of myself as a separate thing? Or at this point, you're just confident that every desire that comes up, you should follow it?
I would never say never. Let's just say rarely. Because I'm not perfect. Nobody is perfect. In order to be considered perfect, you have to have been dead for at least 50 years. It's only after we've been dead for 50 years that the spiritual community will whitewash you of your personality and begin to raise you on the spiritual pedestal. So it's safer to say rarely or not very often. But as I said earlier, if I am triggered by a situation, whatever it is, it doesn't have the power to take me away from myself for very long. That the habit of returning to myself, I've been practicing it since I was 16. It's so well worn that when I find myself lost in experience, it doesn't last long. I just come back to myself, not through any process of investigation, because it doesn't need an investigation anymore. But if it does, one should just go through the investigation. And it doesn't happen very often, but it happens from time to time.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Where are you?
Thank you so much for your teachings and your brilliance.
I can't see you. Where are you?
Oh.
There you are. Yes, yes.
My question is, given this new paradigm that you're elucidating, this consciousness
Can you just hold on so we can hit that?
What is the new creation story? I heard a little bit when you were talking to the other gentleman. The new creation story based on this consciousness-only model. Number one. Number two, was there a universe before humans were able to channel this infinite awareness? And the third part is, when atoms were being formed based on the old...
I can't cope with too many questions at a time. So I'm going to respond to your last question, because I can't remember the first, but we can come back to it. Was there a universe before human minds perceived it? I'm afraid the situation is much worse than that. There isn't a universe as it is normally conceived, even when humans do seem to be perceiving it.
Great. So
what we consider, what we call the universe, is what the activity of infinite consciousness, not the object, the activity or the imagination of infinite consciousness looks like when perceived from our localized perspective. So, what is it that is perceiving? It is consciousness that is perceiving. In other words, the essence of that which perceives and the essence of that which is perceived is the same. They are the same indivisible, infinite whole or reality. Now, what is it that seems to fragment this whole or reality into an apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects known from the perspective of a separate self? It is thought and perception, the finite mind. It is consciousness that, so to speak, puts on a virtual reality headset made of thought and perception, and it refracts itself into a multiplicity and diversity of objects that we call the universe. But in the absence of that VR headset made of thought and perception, there is no longer a separate subject of experience, nor a multiplicity and diversity of objects. There is just infinite consciousness. So what we call the universe is what the activity of infinite consciousness looks like when perceived through the virtual reality headset of thought and perception.
So, what was there before humans came on the scene? Or was there anything there?
There was no before humans came on the scene, because it is thought that makes eternity appear as time. There is no time. It is only thought. So what we call the absence of time, what we sometimes call now, is eternity. It's not in time, it has no dimensions, but refracted through the prism of thought, eternity appears as time.
So then you don't buy the...
Even when there seems to be time, there is in fact not really any time. But in the absence of thought, that is, in the absence of the appearance of time, there is no time, and therefore no before.
That's beautiful. So then, therefore, you don't buy the whole scientific view of the 13.7 billion years of cosmic evolution. That's...
No.
From this perspective, that's another story that we humans tell ourselves.
It's another story, and it's a perfectly valid story. It's a creation myth, and it is a creation myth that is consistent with the belief that what we perceive through the sense perceptions, through thought and perception, is real and in its own right. So it is only from the perspective of common sense, from the perspective of the belief that our thoughts and our perceptions give us an accurate model of reality. This creation myth, the Big Bang, is true only from that perspective, because it is true according to the limitations of that perspective. What I think is a more accurate, but not completely accurate model, because there are no completely accurate models, but what I think is a more accurate model, and one that is consistent with our experience, is this. First of all, we have to understand that time is never experienced. Just very quickly, because I want to make sure this is experiential and not abstract and philosophical. Just all of you try, just for a moment, to step out of the now and visit the place we call the past. See if you can do that. Just step a few seconds out of the now and go to the place we call the past, or indeed the future. Did any of you manage to leave the now and visit the past? So, have any of you ever visited the past? I don't mean to say that you don't have image or memory of the past, but that takes place now. I mean, you actually go to the place, visit the place that we call the past. So nobody, not just those of us that are interested in these matters, none of the 7 billion of us have ever or could ever visit the place we call the past or the future. In other words, the past and the future are never experienced. So we have to rethink what we call the present. The present is not a moment. We sometimes hear in New Age circles about staying in the present moment. There is no present moment. The present is not a moment. The present, what we call now, does not last in time. There is no time present for the now to last in. Now is eternity. So, with this in mind, reconsider the theory of the Big Bang that supposedly existed 13.8 billion years ago. Consider that the now is not moving along a line of time. There is no time for the now to move along. Now is in relation to the line of time, it is a vertical axis. It is ever present now. So all that is contained, any memory that is contained in the mind is present now. It is not present. It is present in the depths of the psyche now. It was not something that took place 13 billion years ago. The only time when anything takes place is the now. This now, the only now there is. And therefore consider the possibility that the creation of the universe, or that the event that is referred to, is something that takes place now. Why don't we experience it? Because due to the limitations of our finite mind, all the finite mind can be aware of is this waking state experience. And because of the glare of the waking state, the depths of the psyche are obscured. And we all know this from our personal experience. There are layers of feeling in us that we are not aware of most of the time because of the exclusive focus of our attention on our thoughts and perceptions. But as soon as we turn away from those thoughts and perceptions, the deeper layers of our own psyche comes up into the light of awareness. Well, consider that if you were to go further down, so to speak, to dig deeper into the depths of the psyche, through the personal unconscious, through the collective unconscious, you would be going not back in time, but into the very recesses, the very origin of the psyche. So I would suggest that the moment that is called, this creation myth about the Big Bang is a creation myth that explains what I've just explained, but references it in terms of the time and space that seem to be real from the perspective of the finite mind.
Thank you. Beautiful.
So I think we've got time for one more question in the front here.
Great, I wanted to
Hold
ask-
on just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, we started late, we've got time for one more question.
I wanted to
Just wait for the mic, please.
Oh, okay, thank you. I wanted to ask about love. My, and I use the word experience of love is boundless. And I'm wanting to understand if it is somehow infused in pure consciousness, if it is an experience, and if it can be a pathway toward, being in pure consciousness.
Love is not a feeling in consciousness, it is the very nature of consciousness. When we love, we feel that the distinction between the self, between ourself and the other, to a greater or lesser extent, collapses. In other words, love is not a relationship. It is the collapse of relationship. It is the absence of relationship. It's why relationship always exists between two entities. Love is the experience of the dissolution of these two entities. That's why Rumi said true lovers never really meet. So love is the revelation of the nature of our shared being. Our being is shared. In our essence, we are all the same infinite, indivisible consciousness. But that knowledge is veiled from us much of the time due to the filter of thought and perception. That's why we feel that we are separate. Feeling that we are separate, as I said earlier, we long for one thing alone, to be divested of the sense of separateness. That's why many people long in the phenomenal realm, above all else, for an intimate relationship. Because in intimate relationship, we feel that everything that separates, we feel that we are divested of the sense of separation. What we are really longing for in intimate relationship is not another person or indeed a relationship. We are longing to be divested of everything that makes us feel that we are separate. So love is the revelation of our shared being. It is the nature of our being.
Yes, how beautiful. Yes, and we...
So just to make one more comment, you said, can love be a path? Yes, when the individual feels the longing for love, that is its reality, the essence of that being, the reality of that being, pulling that being back to it. It's saying, come back to me, I am what you are looking for. So can love be a path? Yes, absolutely. All that is important is that we never make the object of our, we never allow our love to have an object. That what we long for lives at the source of our longing and can never become an object of our longing. If we allow what we long for to become an object of our longing, we will never experience true love.
Yes, it's true. It's limited.
So it's fine to pursue the path of love, but never allow that love to settle on an object or a person.
Yes.
Celebrate that love with an object or a person. I'm not suggesting that one shouldn't seek or have relationships, but don't have relationships in order to find that love. Follow the love, follow it all the way back, not to its, towards the object. Trace it back towards its source. That is what we truly long for. And what we long for lives at the source of our longing. It can never become an object of our longing.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you.
That's what.
Really wonderful.
Thank you.